One of the hot button items during Joe Biden's presidential term was student loan forgiveness. As of last month, Americans owed $1.773 trillion in student debt. That's not the national debt, that's just what they owed in student debt. That's 42.7 million Americans. Those who had borrowed from the government wanted to wipe away the debt, and President Biden tried a few times, even though the Supreme Court told him he couldn't, to wipe all that debt out. Now, it's not controversial if a bank wants to do that. If you have a loan at Citizens Bank and you get a notice saying, hey, we'd like to just, wipe that debt out. We're forgiving all of it. Yeah, your mortgage is no longer here. It's gone. It's paid in full. That would be wonderful. Right? That would be a great blessing. But it's harder when it's on the public dime, isn't it? To have student loan forgiveness when the taxpayer is the one on the hook for that. We understand debt forgiveness because that can affect our life. It's a burden to try to pay off your debt. And most of us have some kind of debt that we're in. Not all of us, and it would be great to get to a point where we didn't for just a little while there. Amy and I didn't. But sold our house and we didn't. But we understand that kind of debt, right? But what about the other kinds of forgiveness, like when we're offended? All of a sudden, that seems like, in some ways, a greater burden even than financial debt. Now, offenses are going to happen. James 3, verse 2 says, "For in many things we offend all. If any man offend not in word, the same is a perfect man, and able also to bridle the whole body." Matthew 18, verse 7, Jesus says, "Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh." So it's inevitable that we're going to sin against others and that others are going to sin against us. And when that happens, there's, in essence, a debt created. And Matthew 18 then talks about offenses and forgiveness, and there's much to learn here. So let's first of all just read verses 15 through 17. Do I have a volunteer to do that? I won't put the microphone in your face as much as I want to for people watching online. I won't do it. 15 to 17. Alice, thank you. All right, so Jesus mentions incremental steps when there's been an offense. You go to the person themselves first. If they hear it, you've gained your brother. If not, you take 2 or 3 with you. And if they hear you again, if with 2 or 3, then you've gained your brother. If not, then you take it before the church. If they hear you again, you've gained your brother. But if not, they are to you as publicans and heathens. So I just asked the question, why do you think Jesus takes this incremental approach? Dan.
Give the person every opportunity possible to want to make it right with him. There would be no excuse for that person to not properly.
Yeah. You've given him a chance to try to make it right. Yeah, good. Amy. Yeah. Yeah, it's about change. It's about getting the other person to think through it, but you want to, exert the least amount that you have to get that change. Alice. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, you ever been told something that someone did? Someone's like, oh, this person did this to me. And then later on, they're like, oh, we worked it out. And you're like, yeah, but I still think badly of that person. Like, you guys worked it out, but you told me. Now I'm burdened with that. Yeah. Good. Any other reasons? Any other thoughts there? Yeah, Russ. Yeah. Yeah. Amy.
Actually, been thinking about this in the past situation where if I correct a student in front of the whole classroom, sort of, I'm not going to be in front of the class. But if I say, hey, eye to eye, look at them and talk to them about their behavior, they just kind of like, okay, I'm very serious. I don't know what that is.
Yeah.
If the witnesses make you more likely.
Yeah.
I've just been noticing it.
Did you imagine if we got to church on Sunday morning and there was like a period during the service where people who had offended, if it was like you had to bring it before the church, everything that you did, you know? Amy says, my husband did not say thank you for the meal, you know? And so the whole church is like, oh, I'm sorry, I offended you. I'm sorry, you know, and then Zach comes up and he's like, yeah, Dan and I got into a fight and, you know, and he didn't, I was right, but he didn't apologize. And, you know, Dan's like, I was right. And then all of a sudden we had to like figure this out. Like the whole service is, every time there's a conflict between two people, the whole church, oh man, what a mess, right? I mean, sometimes it needs to happen that way, but generally we want to try to get things as small as possible, right? But so one of the questions then is, so what's the purpose of forgiveness given all of this? To be more Christ-like? Yeah. Yeah. Resolution, I think Amy said restoration, right? So that's the point of forgiveness. And he starts off with that to say, well, the whole point is that at the end of this, you've gained your brother, that there's a good relationship. Sin breaks, forgiveness heals. So that's what we're looking for. So according to verse 18, what's the essence then of forgiveness? We didn't read it out loud, but looking at it in your study, it says, verily I say unto you, whatsoever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever you shall loose on heaven shall be loosed on earth shall be loosed in heaven. What's the picture there? What's the essence then of forgiveness? Okay. Yeah, well, there's two words that are opposite words that he uses in this verse that kind of tells us what the essence of forgiveness is. Which one of those two would be forgiveness? Loosing, right? Sin binds, forgiveness loosens. So the essence of forgiveness is letting someone go, letting the offense go. And that's an important thing to think about when we talk about forgiveness and what sin really does and what forgiveness is. It is a loosing of someone. All right? So now, what question then does Peter ask in verse number 21? Yeah, I suppose we should read this text, shouldn't we? Here, I'm just skipping right over it. So let's go to verses 21 and 22. Does somebody want to read that out loud? And then we'll get, I'm getting way far ahead of me. 21 and 22. Dan? Yeah.
Then came Peter and said, Lord, how oft shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Jesus saith unto him, I say not unto thee until 7 times.
All right. So Peter asks the question, what was it again?
How oft shall I?
Yeah. Yeah, how often? How many times should I forgive my brother? And so what does Jesus answer? Yeah. Now Peter not very humbly says, how many times if my brother sinned against me should I forgive him? So he assumes it's always going to be somebody else sinning against him, which is probably the way that most of us think about this, right? And he says 7 times? Well, no, it's a great question to ask. One of your children, one of your Sunday school kids comes up and how many times should I forgive? The answer is kind of, well, how many times would you like to be forgiven? You know? So, but Peter thinks 7. Now, I'm told that the rabbis said 3 was how many times you should forgive the person. And they based that off of Job chapter 33, verses 29 to 30, where they talk about how God will forgive 3 times. They're like, well, that must be, like we've been talking about on Wednesday nights, the Pharisees were always like, okay, let's quantify this. to the minutest detail. And for them, well, if God says 3 times, that's it. 3 times is all you have to forgive, and that's it. And but Peter, he's feeling pretty generous. What if I double that and add 1? 7 times. And you're right, Jesus answers 70 times 7. Okay, so what did Jesus seem to mean by this? Always forgive until the 491st offense. And then you don't have to, right? That's it. What do you think when Jesus is, he puts a number on it. Peter puts a number on it, Jesus puts a number on it. Do you think there's really a number there, or is there something else going on? Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to think of anybody who's offended me 490 times. It just doesn't happen, Well, maybe, yeah. I mean, just generally, people kind of learn to not do that anymore, I'm just trying to think, even my kids, I don't think our kids sinned against us 490 times. I don't think we've handed out that many punishments each, Yeah. You think it's been 490? Yeah, no, probably not. So that's just, Dan's right. This is kind of an impossible number. It's kind of an infinite number. He wasn't really saying, all right, up to 491, that's it. He's saying, well, you lose count at some point. You're supposed to just forgive and forgive and forgive and forgive. So then we get to the parable. And he starts off by saying, therefore is the kingdom of heaven likened unto a certain king, which would take account of his servants. And when he had begun to reckon, one was brought unto him, which owed him 10,000 talents. But forasmuch as he had not to pay, his Lord commanded him to be sold, and his wife, and children, and all that he had, and payment to be made. The servant therefore fell down and worshipped him, saying, Lord, have patience with me, and I will pay thee all. Then the Lord of that servant was moved with compassion, and loosed him, and forgave him the debt. There's that word again, huh? But the same servant went out and found one of his fellow servants, which owed him 100 pence, and he laid hands on him, and took him by the throat, and said, Pay me that thou owest. And his fellow servant fell down at his feet, and besought him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will pay thee all. And he would not, but went and cast him into prison till he should pay the debt. So when his fellow servants saw what was done, they were very sorry, and came and told unto their Lord all that was done. Then his Lord, after that he had called him, said unto him, O thou wicked servant, I forgave thee all that debt, because thou desirest me. Shouldest not thou also have had compassion on thy fellow servant, even as I had pity on thee? And his Lord was wroth, and delivered him to the tormentors, till he should pay all that was due unto him. So likewise shall my heavenly Father do also unto you, if ye from your hearts forgive not every one his brother their trespasses. All right, so the situation, who's the first person mentioned here in the parable? The king, all right? And who might the king represent? Yeah, Christ or God. Now, I had some commentators saying, no, I don't think that's right. It doesn't. And part of it is because he takes back his forgiveness at the end. So we said at the beginning that every parable, every illustration breaks down somewhere. But I think according to verse number 35, if Jesus makes the correlation between the Heavenly Father, then I think that's a good correlation to say that this is talking about God as the king. So what did the king in this parable do? He decided to do something. He called up Elon Musk and said, let's look through the books. Doge, let's look through the books. And what did all the servants have to do? Well, so the first thing that he did, what's the first thing that he did here? Yep. He took account of his servants and he began to reckon. And as he was doing that, one of them came forward. So this picture, what is this picture then? This idea of having of the king taking account of his servants. What is that a picture of? I think it's a picture of us having to give account to God, that we, in some ways, are owing to God. Romans 14:12 says, so then every one of us shall give account of himself to God. 2 Corinthians 5:10 says, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body according to that which he hath done, whether it be good or bad. So I think this is the picture here, that there is, when we think about sin, that it really is an offense toward God, that there is something there, that it's not just something that happens and goes off into the universe, but that there's an offense with God, and that God expects there to be something there. God doesn't just, well, it's not a big deal, whatever. These things happen. There's all kinds of things that happen in the world that I'm just like, it doesn't matter to me at all. But sin is not one of those things. And so I think it's just an important thing to think about that aspect when you think about this parable. So we have the first servant, and how much does this first servant owe? 10,000 talents. Anybody look up what a talent was? How much that was? A lot. I'm told that a talent was 20 years' wages. Yeah, that you could buy your freedom with it. If you were a slave, it would take a whole talent to buy your freedom. Warren Wiersbe says that what Palestine or Israel owed Rome per year was 800 talents. The whole country had to pay Rome 800 talents as tribute every year. So this guy owed, that 12 times that or something, yeah. Dan? Yeah, and that's in whatever year that was published. Who knows what it is today, right? Yeah, the idea, and 10,000 in the Hebrew is just like the biggest number kind of there was. I mean, there are others, but it was just kind of it was an astronomical number. I mean, it was so unrealistic that nobody would actually borrow that much. If Dan came in and said, I'm not having a great week, Citizens finally called in my loan and I owe them $52 million. It'd be like, what? What did you do with all that money? Is it invested somewhere? You can pull it back out and give it to them, But we understand this is just a lot of money. What does the servant beg? Have patience. Yeah. Now, part of the reason he's doing this is because the king says, well, we're going to sell you and your wife and your kids and everything you have to pay off this debt. It's not going to do much, but at least I'll feel better about it, And he says, have patience with me and I'll pay it off. Now, could this debt be repaid? No, there's no way. There's no way. So what does debt then represent in the story? Yeah, trespasses. Specifically here, then against God, right? Sins against God. So what does that represent then for us, this whole scenario? Yeah. Yeah, when we sin against God, this is what the first servant toward the king is represented as, that we owe a lot. Now, it's not a debt we could ever pay. It's not a debt that we could ever hope to even think about getting a little bit paid off. And that's the idea, right? It's just an astronomical amount. If you had that much, I would be happy if I owed someone $100 and they forgave it. You'd know if Citizens Bank called me and said, actually, we don't have to do all this. We're just going to let you have that for free. You would all know about that. That'd be the greatest thing ever. Same thing if you had all that debt paid off, we'd hear about it, right? That would be just the greatest thing ever. But this is the GDP of small African countries. This is just an astronomical amount, and it was that's how much he owed. So question 7, then what does the king do? Yeah, he forgave him his debt. Good. So then this servant, how does he respond? What does the servant do in verse 28? Yeah. And it's interesting too, the guy doesn't come to him, the debtor doesn't come to him. He actually goes and finds this guy out, right? Finds the guy, and what does he do? What does the Bible say he does? He puts his hands around his throat. Just kind of throttles him. You're not getting away from me, pal. And he says, pay me that thou owest. Now, how much did it say that he owed? Yeah, 100 pence. Does anybody know about how much that is? Anybody look that up? Well, so 1 pence was 1 day's wage. So however you want to do that, it was about 3 months' wages. Probably more than $44, but not, 10,000 talents. It wasn't an insubstantial amount, but it was something that he actually probably could pay off eventually. Now, that doesn't help our story, but the idea is it was a much, 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 much smaller debt. Yeah, Zach. Yeah, roughly, depending on how much you make. Yeah. 3 months' wage, about that, right? And who knows how much they made back then, but it's just kind of the idea. It's a smaller amount, right? So, what does the second servant ask? Yeah, he says the exact same words. Have patience with me, and I will pay thee all. He wasn't ready to pay it, so he asks for some time to pay it. So who does the second servant then represent? Okay. Well, if we're the first servant, and the idea is that we've had our debt cleared by the king, and someone else owes us, that the second servant then would be someone who sinned against me, because in the same idea, they owe me. They're in debt to me, right? I was in debt to God, but then they're in debt to me. So the second servant would be represented by anybody who has offended you, that you should forgive, because you have this debt. They have this debt that they owe to you, right? Now, what does this first servant do in the story? Yeah, he doesn't. He throws him in prison until he has to pay everything. Now, I didn't get a real good bead on how that works, how that system works. It seems like if you're out and working, you can pay off the debt a lot faster than if you're in a prison. But they used to have debtor's prison, and I don't know if they made you just the hard labor of doing it. They paid you a certain amount, or how they worked that. But it was kind of the idea that you put them into prison until they could pay it, or till maybe your family could scrounge enough money to get you out, as soon as it was paid off. Anybody have any insights to that or anything? No. Okay. Well, so I don't know exactly all that, but that's something that they would have understood in that day. So, what does that then represent? Yeah, my unforgiveness to other people that sin against me. So Peter, he thinks, 7, and that's it. And that 8th time, that's it. I don't have to forgive him. And Jesus is saying, well, then you're like this first servant who refuses to let that debt go, right? What's behind a refusal to forgive someone? Alice comes up to me and says, I'm sorry I said that, I'm sorry I did that, and will you forgive me? And I say, no. Generally pride, right? Sometimes. Most of the time, I think pride. Pride, I think, because we feel like we're worth forgiving, and they're not. Of course God would forgive me. I'm me. I'm wonderful. That person, though, they're not worth my forgiveness. So there is something in that. It seems like if you heard this story, you would think it's a very natural thing that this first servant would want to forgive the debt of this other person. But there's something in this wicked servant's heart that he says, I refuse to forgive the debt of this other person. Now the king has a reaction. The other servants hear, and they go snitch. I mean, they go tell the king, and so what does he do? He hauls them back in, yeah. And what does he say should be the motivation for the first servant to have forgiven the second servant? Yeah, compassion. Yeah. You know what that feels like to have your debt forgiven? Remember that? Wouldn't you like to give that feeling to someone else? Why didn't you? Why did you feel like you had to throw this person in prison instead? So what happened to this first servant then? Yeah. Not just that he was thrown into prison, but he was thrown into the tormentors until it was repaid, which is forever. So now let's just turn the page here and look at some application. What's the point of this parable? Yeah. Yeah, because you've been forgiven so much, you ought to forgive anything. We ought to be ready to forgive others. There's nothing that someone else has done to you that you haven't done to God that's much worse, right? God, there's nothing, there's no sin against, that someone sinned against you that is worse than what you've sinned against God. And if God has forgiven you, then you ought to forgive others. And God is holy. He has less reason to forgive you because sin is really heinous. If I sin against Terry, it's one sinner sinning against another sinner. And that doesn't mitigate it, but it's also like, it's not as offensive as when we sin against God because God's holy. Yeah. Amy? Oh, I thought you said your hand up. No. Okay. So I asked here, what's the danger of not forgiving according to verse 35? Yeah.
That's a pretty scary one.
Yeah. God says, I won't forgive you then either. Now, how do we understand this? Because we understand salvation in a different way. What's going on here? How do we understand this idea of if we refuse to forgive? You know, and I've had people in my life that I've talked to about forgiveness, and they say, listen, I won't ever forgive that person. And I'm not asking them to like totally reconcile with them and you have to go back to the way things were and all of that, but just in their own heart, they refuse to forgive. Should I tell that person, well, you're not saved, obviously? No. So what's going on here? How do we make this work in a language that we understand and not take away from what Jesus is saying? Yeah. Yeah, there's a disconnect there for a believer to say, I refuse to forgive, and yet have experienced the forgiveness of God. They're showing in a way that they don't really understand how bad sin really is. Yeah.
I guess that's my opinion. How people really say.
That's, I think, the point. Not saying you aren't, but it's like if you understand salvation, you would understand how much you've been forgiven, and it would be pretty easy to forgive somebody else. Not easy, but it would be much easier given that context of what you've been forgiven. And if you can't do that or don't do that, that seems to indicate that you don't really understand what you've been forgiven. And maybe you don't understand because you're not saved. You know, not that, and again, here's where every illustration breaks down. God's not going to haul me up and say, you're not forgiving that person, you don't get to go to heaven anymore. But it's such a serious correlation that it's important for us to think about it in that way. Alice? Yeah. 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 Yeah, I mean, that passage in Hebrews is Hebrews 12 where it talks about the root of bitterness springing up and defiling many. There's the same idea that when it's not, bitterness is not going to be very far behind unforgiveness. It's going to be pretty hard to say, well, yeah, I'm not bitter, but I'm not forgiving either. Well, just wait then, it'll come. It's kind of, that's just the nature of it. I think, given verse 18 and on the heels of verse 15, there could be a nice application here regarding the church. If there's some offense that has happened and the church decides we are not going to forgive, then it could be that there are consequences on the church then as well, that God would say, well, then I'm not going to forgive you either. Not that he's not going to forgive us eternally, but that there will be consequences. There will be, if you will show mercy, God will show mercy. If you won't show mercy, then you're saying, this is the way I want things to be. I don't want there to be mercy for me either. And that's not a very safe place to be either. So maybe I'm not saying that God would take away your eternal life, but there would be consequences for you because, and even just both of you talked about the natural consequences of bitterness, but there could even be some other things where people aren't going to forgive you either. You're going to be at odds with other people. Things are going to go badly in your life, and it's because you just refuse to forgive. So it's so important that we make sure we get that right. Russ?
It's a real difficult thing there because I have never been so offended in a deep way, any way that I could have it. I mean, even I think not being saved, I think I look at my life, I've never been so badly offended that I could forgive that person for whatever, if they came looking for it, right?
Yeah.
I think of somebody like Corey Ten, her testimony,
Yeah.
what happened with her, actually seeing the man that actually had a part in killing her sister. Her dearest, closest friend was her sister. Here's this man that came up to her and asked her forgiveness, and she stick her hand out and say, yes, brother, I forgive you. She said, I needed every ounce of the Holy Spirit, right?
Yeah.
Me and you can't relate to that because it didn't happen.
Yeah.
So we talk about forgiveness. Think about some woman that was maybe brutalized by some man, some horrible way.
Like Amnon and Tamar, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then you get saved, and yet you have that. I mean, I can't even explain what a woman must feel like what happens to her, right?
Yeah.
So how can I sit there and say, she's not saved or saved because she's dealing with this tormented, and it might take a while. I think God, of course, could over time give this person that ability to forgive. But I have never experienced it. How can I sit here and judge that person or say that person's this or that because I don't understand the psychology that goes behind that tormenting of a person anymore. We could go on and on about just the horrors of what could happen in this life.
Yeah.
That hasn't happened to any one of us. So that sometimes I can get on my high horse and think, oh yeah. It's like, no, you can't. It's too hard to understand.
Yeah.
That's a very, I don't know, gray area, tough area for me, I guess. How you've been offended.
It is, yeah. I mean, there's someone who is close to me that was, but molested as a child by a sibling. And when I talked to them about it, they said, I won't forgive. I can't. And can't and won't are different terms, but it was the idea. And I wasn't ready to say, well, then you're not a believer. But there is something about, like, I don't understand all of what you're going through, and I'm not saying you have to, go play nice with this person, or that you even have to think well of them, especially if they're not repenting, but to have the heart of, Lord, I release that, and to offload that debt is, I think, what Christ is talking about here. It's a difficult thing to do, and I think you're right. Most of us don't really experience that, and so it's really easy for us to say, well, come on, how hard could it be? Because we don't know. We're not saying that. We're just saying this is the principle that God puts out there. And if you're right, if Corey Ten Boom can forgive something as brutal as that and has the ability to through the power of the Holy Spirit, then any believer does. It's not a matter of impossibility. It's a matter of a desire in some way. Yeah. Amy, you had your hand up.
I would just say that in verse 35, forgiving your brother. So I'm going to say that this is right that's offended against you.
Yeah.
In some ways, not to say you can't forgive the worst thing. Someone
Yeah.
Because if it's a believer who's sitting next to you, you share a common Savior, you have common ground. Not saying that I wouldn't feel like I needed to forgive them, but it would be much different. I would be relying on. I would have to teach me how to handle it in that situation. But I
Yeah.
think the context here is another believer.
Yeah, it's hard to know how plastic that word brother is if it's talking to Jewish people about Jewish. But I mean, you can't just take the Bible and make it that. I think it's a good point. It's the word is brother here. It's a fellow servant, so we're talking probably about another professing Christian. And obviously, God's holding them to a higher standard too, you know. So,
I think the context of Matthew 18,
yeah,
like following on the heels of that.
yeah, yeah. So there is something about that, and not saying that you shouldn't forgive unbelievers, but there is a different category for that. Yeah, yeah, Marlene.
I'm going to put it this, love God and Lord that words protect us. There was a time I had a choice in the courtroom to sentence a person. I came to my mom at that time. What did Jesus say as he hung on the cross? Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. So I forgave that person.
Yeah,
When they want to be like Jesus.
sure. Yeah,
Like Jesus.
yeah. And there is something about, you know, in a legal sense, the person still deserves justice, and you can still forgive them in your heart. So it's not like just because you're a Christian, you don't ever press charges or go talk to the authorities about something that's done, you know. If you feel like the Lord is leading you to not, you know, my house got robbed, I'm just not going to file a police report. I guess that's between you and the Lord, but you're sure welcome to. And justice is still an important part of that whole thing, too. In this parable, question 13, we see the importance of forgiveness, but he has to talk about it because it's not always easy to forgive. What are some things, sometimes things that stand in the way of our extending forgiveness?
I would say, for me anyway, you know, that after that, there's contrition.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
The other one would be that they refuse to acknowledge their fault. It still kind of rattles me, the offense in which this person did against me. And yet I've told her many times that I forgive her, I'm not holding anything against her. Yet this person told me that I'll never forgive you. And I actually went through Matthew here and said, you know, if you don't forgive, God's not gonna forgive you either. But that just went over her head, and it's like, I don't even know what to say when you think about it.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, I'll never forgive you. I'm like, what? I actually laugh about it now, but I can't get my head around it.
Yeah.
It's like, I didn't do anything to you, why did I even, how can you not forgive me when I didn't do anything to you?
Yeah.
You can't even verbalize what I did. So it's really,
Yeah.
so I guess for me, I can, again, nothing's ever been so serious to me that I can't forgive somebody. I hold some grudges, I guess. But I mean, it's like.
What a fun euphemism there, Russ. No,
When you think about it, it's like I hold.
I'm not sinfully angry, I'm frustrated. Sorry.
No, I get it. But you're
Yeah.
saying totally, because that's, again, you know the Lord works on our heart, right? You can't feel that way. You don't get away with it, right?
Yeah.
God gets in you. If you're really, truly, you know, looking close to God, He's not going to let you get away with it. He convicts you of those things. On from Him.
Yeah.
And I feel today, right now, as I speak to you, I feel totally at ease about unforgiveness, thank God for that.
Yeah.
But it's just interesting, when someone holds what against you, when something you haven't done, and then to sit there and tell myself, okay, how can I not be mad about this?
Right.
You know, and I'm
Yeah.
sometimes I struggle. If I think about it for too long, I don't know if I'm different than anyone else, if I think about it too long, then I get a little upset.
Yeah.
I'm gonna stop it.
I think lack of contrition kind of points to the fact that we feel like if we forgive them, that there's nothing that they're not going to learn their lesson, right? If it's contrition, at least, then they're like, I've learned my lesson. I shouldn't have done that. I'm never going to do that again, or whatever. And whether they mean it or not, you know, whether that's actually going to happen, at least it's there, right? And you say, well, okay, you learned your lesson. But if I just say I forgive you, then they're like, oh, awesome, like free stuff. And you're like, no, that's not what I'm doing. But it comes off like that, you know, and so we say, well, no, I'm going to make sure that they feel that debt so that when I forgive them, that they actually appreciate it. But that's not, of course, what God calls us to do. He calls us just to forgive. That's one of the reasons that we don't. Sometimes we're afraid that they'll do it again. We want to protect ourselves, and if I just forgive them, then they're going to keep offending, keep offending, keep offending. And so it's important for us to let them know. I think there's a way that you can say to a person, you know, Jesus talks about this in other ways, like going to a brother, hey, you offended me when you did that. You know, that was something I tried to forget, something I tried to put out of my mind, and I can't. So I'm coming to you, again, brother, and saying this is an offense between us that I can't get over. You know, will you do something about it? Or you offended them, and you go and talk to them. But it's the idea that we don't want that to happen again and again and again, to give them a free pass that keeps us sometimes from forgiving. Sometimes we also don't want to minimize what happened to us through forgiveness. If I say I forgive you, then that means it's not a big deal what happened to me, and it absolutely was. So I want them to know, hey, you really, really hurt me when you did that. And I'm still willing to forgive you, but I need you to know that, and that's part of the contrition as well. So these are some of the struggles, some of the reasons that we don't. Deep passage, important passage. Anything else in the passage that you noticed that we didn't bring up, or questions that you had? Yeah, Jacob. Not necessarily. I think it's just more a picture of how much our sins are an offense to God, how the debt to God is unpayable, and yet he paid it. And our debt to others are payable, and yet we often say, you know, I won't forgive you for that. I think it's more the contrast of that and the holiness of God. That's my opinion, though. Good question. Anybody else? Anything that you noticed that you were hoping to bring up, or tidbits that you thought of?